Previously, we discussed how the journalist and author Fredrick Olmsted got lost on his journey to find the prominent planter Mr. W. In this commentary, Olmsted finally arrives at his destination, and he has a revealing discussion with the slave master about Negro and Irish laborers. Now, after leaving Mr. W's mansion, Olmsted visits yet another farmer, right? But this farmer was different, and he was different because he was a former slave master. This ex-slave master shares with Olmsted the one reason that caused him to stop owning people. And what is that reason, you may ask? To find out, we have to open up the PDF version of the book titled A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States and turn to page 89, where he writes this.
Mr. W's house was an old family mansion, which he had himself remodeled in the Grecian style and furnished with a large wooden portico. An oak forest had originally occupied the ground where it stood, but this having been cleared and the soil worn out in cultivation by the previous proprietors, pine woods now surrounded it in every direction, a square of a few acres only being kept clear immediately about it. Mr. W. was one of the few large planters of his vicinity who still made the culture of tobacco their principal business. He said there was a general prejudice against tobacco in all the Tidewater region of the state, because it was through the culture of tobacco that the once fertile soils had been impoverished.
Meaning it became unfavorable by many because growing tobacco was thought to overly deplete the nutrients from the land.
But he did not believe that, at the present value of Negroes, their labor could be applied to the culture of grain with any profit, except under peculiarly favorable circumstances.
So in other words, if he wanted to continue making money from slave labor, he still had to grow tobacco, whether it depleted the land or not. Here we go.
Possibly the use of guano might make wheat a paying crop, but he still doubted. He had not used it himself. Tobacco required fresh land and was rapidly exhausting, but it returned more money for the labor used upon it than anything else. Enough more, in his opinion, to pay for the wearing out of the land. If he was well paid for it, he did not know why he should not wear out his land. His tobacco fields were nearly all in a distant and lower part of his plantation, land which had been neglected before his time in a great measure because it had been sometimes flooded and was, much of the year, too wet for cultivation. He was draining and clearing it, and it now brought good crops.
He was having people drain it for him because we all know a wealthy planter was hardly going to do any physical labor. So who did he have draining it for him? Let's see.
He had an Irish gang draining for him by contract.
He brought in the Irish folks to do the back-breaking soil work, right? Just like Mr. C did on his DC farm. And they were hired by contract, right? They weren't permanent laborers on the farm. So once they finished digging the ditches and clearing the land, their work was done, right? Let's continue.
He thought a Negro could do twice as much work in a day as an Irishman.
Uh-oh.
He had not stood over them and seen them at work, but judged entirely from the amount they accomplished. He thought a good gang of Negroes would have got on twice as fast.
And remember, most Negroes were said to labor slowly. But the master here claims that the Irish were twice as slow. Ooh-wee, I could only imagine. Here we go.
He was sure they must have trifled a great deal, or they would have accomplished more than they had.
They spent a lot of time out there looking around and shooting the breeze instead of working, right? And he figured that because he knew that there should have been way more work done than what was done, right? You've been out here for 8 hours and that's all y'all have done, right? He for sure knew that they trifled a great deal. Here we go.
He complained much also of their sprees and quarrels.
Sprees in this context likely refers to some form of unrestrained behavior like drinking out of control and general rowdiness. And quarrels are obviously bickering and arguing amongst each other, and likely with him too. All while they were supposed to be working, right? Pay attention.
I asked why he should employ Irishmen in preference to doing the work with his own hands.
Own hands is not referring to his actual physical hands, right? The wealthy planters don't do that type of work. It's referring to the laborers he has on his plantation, the extensions of his hand, right? So let's get that clear. But isn't that a good question to ask? If they worked twice as slow as the Negroes, trifled a great deal and they quarreled a lot, what are you doing hiring them, right? Here's his answer.
It's dangerous work, and a Negro's life is too valuable to be risked at it. If a Negro dies, it's a considerable loss, you know?
You hear that? The Negro's life is too valuable to be risked doing that type of dangerous work, right? Which implies that he valued the Negro slaves more than the Irish workers. And this is obviously in the context of economics. So when he says that the Negro's life is too valuable, he's not referring to their inherent worth as humans. He's referring to them as tools of labor, right? The Negro's life was more valuable than the Irish because they produced greater economic benefits than the Irish workers. And since he didn't want to risk the Negroes doing dangerous work, he simply hired the Irish to do that, right? Who he said worked twice as slow and wasted a lot of time. So for him, it was worth the trade-off, right? Let's continue.
He afterwards said that his Negroes never worked so hard as to tire themselves, always were lively and ready to go off on a frolic at night,
which included dancing, singing, socializing, and other forms of entertainment that made up a significant portion of their culture while enslaved, right? A frolic night provided an emotional escape from the harsh realities of the day. Here we go.
He did not think they ever did half a day's work. They could not be made to work hard. They never would lay out their strength freely, and it was impossible to make them do it.
So his report was similar to many other reports on Negro work ethic while enslaved. His mentioning of Negroes doing twice as much work as the Irish did not reflect how great workers the Negroes were. What it really reflected was how bad the Irish were, at least when it came to these areas of work. So it's not as if the Negroes were these superstar laborers, right? And rightfully so, because who in their right mind is going to expend all their energy laboring and not get compensated for it, right? Nobody is. And that's why they could not be made to work hard, and they would not lay out all their strength freely, right? Let's continue.
This is just what I have thought when I have seen slaves at work. They seem to go through the motions of labor without putting strength into them. They keep their powers in reserve for their own use at night, perhaps.
That was Olmsted's observation. He was in agreement with Mr. W. that they for sure moved slow, and it appeared to Olmsted that they were just going through the motion and saving up all their energy to get wild at night, right? Pay attention.
Mr. W. also said that he cultivated only the coarser and lower-priced sorts of tobacco because the finer sorts required more painstaking and discretion than it was possible to make a large gang of Negroes use.
Meaning he only grew the lower grade tobacco because it demanded less precision and care to cultivate. He told Olmsted that he could not grow the finer tobacco because it required more decision making than what a large gang of Negroes were capable of handling, right? Now listen closely to what's about to come out of Mr. W's mouth. Here we go.
You can make a nigger work,
he said,
but you cannot make him think.
Tying right back into what they believed to be an inherent intellectual inferiority in those they called N-words. And you can only imagine just how many times they were told this by a frustrated master. And after some time, they internalized it and they believed in it, just like Dr. E. Franklin Frazier said in his book, Black Bourgeoisie. The Negro came to believe in his own inferiority, right? And at this point, it had been over 200 years of that belief being jammed down their throat, right? And that's how it became a dominant part of Negro consciousness, right? Think about it and let's keep going.
Although Mr. W. was very wealthy, or at least would be considered so anywhere at the North, and was a gentleman of education, his style of living was very farmer-like and thoroughly Southern. On their plantations generally, the Virginia gentlemen seemed to drop their full dress and constrained town habits and to live a free, rustic shooting jacket life. We dined in a room that extended out rearwardly from the house, and which, in a northern establishment, would have been the kitchen. The cooking was done in a detached log cabin, and the dishes brought some distance through the open air by the servants. The outer door was left constantly open, though there was a fire in an enormous old fireplace, large enough, if it could have been distributed sufficiently, to have lasted a New York seamstress the best part of the winter. By the door, there was indiscriminate admittance to Negro children and foxhounds, and on an average there were 4 of these, grinning or licking their chops, on either side of my chair, all the time I was at the table. A stout woman acted as head waitress, employing 2 handsome little mulatto boys as her aides in communicating with the kitchen, from which relays of hot cornbread of an excellence quite new to me were brought at frequent intervals. There was no other bread and but one vegetable served, sweet potato, roasted in ashes, and this, I thought, was the best sweet potato, also, that I ever had eaten. But there were 4 preparations of swine's flesh, besides fried fowls, fried eggs, cold roast turkey, and opossum, cooked I know not how, but it somewhat resembled baked sucking pig. The only beverages on the table were milk and whiskey. I was pressed to stay several days with Mr. W., and should have been glad to have accepted such hospitality, had not another engagement prevented.
Now it's off to the next journey.
When I was about to leave, an old servant was directed to get a horse, and go with me, as guide, to the railroad station at Colonel Gillen's. He followed behind me, and I had great difficulty in inducing him to ride near enough to converse with me. I wished to ascertain from him how old the different stages of the old field forest growth by the side of our road might be. But for a long time he was, or pretended to be, unable to comprehend my questions. When he did so, the most accurate information he could give me was that he reckoned such a field, in which the pines were now some 60 feet high, had been planted with tobacco the year his old master bought him. He thought he was about 20 years old then, and that now he was 40. He had every appearance of being 70. He frequently told me there was no need for him to go any further, and that it was a dead, straight road to the station, without any forks. As he appeared very eager to return, I was at length foolish enough to allow myself to be prevailed upon to dispense with his guidance, gave him $0.25 for his time that I had employed, and went on alone. The road, which for a short distance further was plain enough, soon began to ramify, and in half an hour we were stumbling along a dark wood path, looking eagerly for a house. At length, seeing one across a large clearing, we went through a long lane, opening gates and letting down bars, until we met 2 Negroes, riding a mule, who were going to the plantation near the schoolhouse which we had seen the day before. Following them thither, we knew the rest of the way. Jane gave a bound and neighed when we struck the old road, showing that she had been lost as well as I up to the moment.
Jane was the name of the horse he rented.
It was 20 minutes after the hour given in the timetable for the passage of the train when I reached the station, but it had not arrived, nor did it make its appearance for a quarter of an hour longer, so I had plenty of time to deliver Tom's wife's message and take leave of Jane.
Tom was a slave who lived on a separate plantation than his wife. When Olmsted got lost prior to arriving to Mr. W.'s mansion, he arrived at Colonel Gillen's plantation, which is near the train station where Tom was owned, right? After leaving there, Olmsted got lost again, and he ended up on another plantation where Tom's wife was enslaved. Olmsted conversed with her, and in doing so, he revealed that he had just come from Colonel Gillen's plantation. So she asked him if he had seen a black man named Tom, right? And he said yes. Then she asked him if he planned to return to Gillen's plantation, and he replied yes. Then she asked Olmsted if he would relay a message to Tom, her husband. And again, Olmsted replied yes. So now Olmsted is near the train station after leaving Mr. W.'s house, where he noticed that he had plenty of time to deliver Tom's wife's message, right? So he does so. Then he goes on to his next destination, where he meets the ex-slave owner. Here we go.
I have been visiting a farm, cultivated entirely by free labor. The proprietor told me that he was first led to disuse slave labor, not from any economical considerations, but because he had become convinced that there was an essential wrong in holding men in forced servitude with any other purpose than to benefit them alone, and because he was not willing to allow his own children to be educated as slave masters.
So what happened to him? New beliefs had been cultivated in the garden of his mind, which had taken over the old ones, right? He had come to believe that it was wrong to hold other humans as slaves. And what follows dominant beliefs and desires? Actions do. Since he really believed that it was wrong to do this, his actions followed in the form of no longer using slave labor. Now, if he would have continued to have these strong convictions, but then still owned other people as slaves, then he would have found himself in a state of torment, right? That's what happened when people do things that do not align with their beliefs and values. It creates an uncomfortable type of tension in the chest or in the stomach area, right? Which communicates to a person that what they're doing is not in proper alignment with their value system. But he didn't have to worry about that because what he was doing was right in the sight of the Lord, right? And in addition to that, he was not willing to allow his children to be educated in the ways of the slave master. Now let's get some more.
His father had been a large slaveholder, and he felt very strongly the bad influence it had had on his own character.
He was turned into a copy of his father, and he realized that that version of himself had a character defect, right? It wasn't a color thing like the European colonizers imposed on much of the world to believe, right? It's never been a color thing. It's always been a character, cultural, and a consciousness thing, right? And these are areas that can be modified by the human, which is why the ex-slave master was able to change his ways. Here we go.
He wished me to be satisfied that Jefferson uttered a great truth when he asserted that slavery was more pernicious to the white race than the black.
That's the ex-slave master telling this to Olmsted. How Jefferson was right when he said that slavery was more damaging to the blacks than to the whites. And he's speaking in terms of what slavery did to their character.
Although, therefore, a chief part of his inheritance had been in slaves, he had liberated them all. Most of them had, by his advice, gone to Africa. These he had frequently heard from. Except a child that had been drowned, they were, at his last account, all alive, in general good health, and satisfactorily prospering. He had lately received a letter from one of them, who told him that he was studying to preach the gospel, and who had evidently greatly improved, both intellectually and morally, since he left here. With regard to those going north, and the common opinion that they encountered much misery, and would be much better off here, he said that it entirely depended on the general character and habits of the individual. It was true of those who were badly brought up, and who had acquired indolent and vicious habits, especially if they were drunkards, but, if of some intelligence and well-trained, they generally represented themselves to be successful and contented. He mentioned 2 remarkable cases that had come under his own observation of this kind. One was that of a man who had been free, but, by some fraud and informality of his papers, was re-enslaved. He ran away and afterwards negotiated by correspondence with his master and purchased his freedom. This man he had accidentally met 15 years afterwards in a northern city. He was engaged in profitable and increasing business, and showed him by his books that he was possessed of property to the amount of $10,000.
From my source, it was calculated to be an equivalent between 350 and 400K in 2024 U.S. purchasing power. So he was doing all right for himself.
He was living a great deal more comfortably and wisely than ever his old master had done. The other case was that of a colored woman who had obtained her freedom, and who became apprehensive that she also was about to be fraudulently made a slave again. She fled to Philadelphia, where she was nearly starved at first.
Some of the people they called Negroes were simply willing to do whatever it took to never get back on that plantation, right? The lady here was nearly about to starve to death before she went back. And this is something we have to respect, right? And this is what else happened to her.
A little girl who heard her begging in the streets to be allowed to work for bread told her that her mother was wanting some washing done, and she followed her home. The mother, not knowing her, was afraid to trust her with the articles to be washed. She prayed so earnestly for the job, however, suggesting that she might be locked into a room until she had completed it, that it was given her. So she commenced life in Philadelphia. 10 years afterwards he had accidentally met her there. She recognized him immediately, recalled herself to his recollection, manifested the greatest joy at seeing him, and asked him to come to her house, which he found a handsome 3-story building, furnished really with elegance, and she pointed out to him, from the window, 3 houses in the vicinity that she owned and rented. She showed great anxiety to have her children well educated, and was employing the best instructors for them which she could procure in Philadelphia.
That's climbing out of the pit. She had to put the work in and make the hard sacrifices during her lifetime so her children could reap the benefits and have a better starting point in their life, right? Think about that, and let's finish up.
This gentleman, notwithstanding his anti-slavery sentiments, by no means favors the running away of slaves, and thinks the abolitionists have done immense harm to the cause they have at heart. He wishes Northerners would mind their business, and leave slavery alone, say but little about it, nothing in the present condition of affairs at the South, and never speak of it but in a kind and calm manner. He would not think it right to return a fugitive slave, but he would never assist one to escape. He has several times purchased slaves, generally such as his neighbors were obliged to sell, and who would otherwise have been taken South. This he had been led to do by the solicitation of some of their relatives. He had retained them in his possession until their labor had in some degree returned their cost to him, and he could afford to provide them with the means of going to Africa or the North, and a small means of support after their arrival. Having received some suitable training in his family, they had, without exception, been successful, and had frequently sent him money to purchase the freedom of relatives or friends they had left in slavery.
So commendable for that time on both sides. The side of the ex-slave master for buying some of the relatives of those he had freed and allowing them to purchase them, and on the side of the freed for keeping connections and actually going through with buying the freedom for their loved ones, right? So at this point in the commentary, we have heard from Mr. W., who was a wealthy Virginia planter, and we also heard from the ex-slave owner, right? So on the next commentary, we're going to hear a little bit more from Olmsted and his observations regarding the Negro's love of luxury. So you're certainly going to want to be on the lookout for that. But as of right now, I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.